Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bulin, and I'm a PhD student from Rutgers University. So first of all, welcome everyone to our LERA Best Paper session. And our theme today is international and comparative industrial relations. So as we know, we all live in a period in which the national economy are interconnected, and globalization is impacting industrial relations across companies and countries. So today we have 5 excellent presentations, and they are going to discuss how such trends has impacted labor market outcomes. So we will hear from our speakers about how international workers, immigrants, environmental regulations, or GSE factors has impacted various labor market outcomes in different countries. So before we start today's session, I just want to let you know that you could either ask questions through the chat box or use the hand raise feature and ask questions lively when the discussion part begins. Now let's get started. So our first presenter is Matt Hinkel. So Matt is a PhD candidate in the School of Human Resource and Labor Relations at Michigan State University. So Matt's research focuses on 2 main areas. So his first focus is on labor market issues in the construction industry, including the prevailing wage laws, immigration, and misclassification of construction workers as independent contractors. And his second research focus is on employment relation issues in sports, where he's primarily interested in examining the effects of union representation on athlete outcomes and examining union voting behavior of athletes. Now I'm going to hand it over to Matt.
Okay, thank you very much. Just share my screen here. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to be presenting what is effectively a deeper analysis of the effects of immigrant labor on construction labor markets. And I should note, even though this involves immigration, this is a US focused study, focused on the US construction industry. So as some of you probably know, one of the foremost questions in labor economics over the past few decades is, does immigration harm or improve labor market outcomes of natives? So there are some models that suggest negative effects, but there also could be a theoretical basis for no or even positive effects, such that immigrants might fill niches in the labor market that natives might not otherwise fill. And because of that, there is a relative lack of consensus about the magnitude or sign of immigration effects. While most studies find little to no impact, some other work, most notably by George Borjas, has found negative effects of immigration. So you might be asking, why construction? Well, it is a common practice in this literature to look at multiple industries simultaneously, but we believe that narrowing the focus to construction is warranted because it presents a relatively unique case of competition between native-born and immigrant labor, given that it is a blue-collar, relatively lower-skill industry. And so this competition can create substitution effects that might in fact drive negative impacts of immigration in construction that we've seen shown in other studies. And this would be more in line with competitive model predictions. But also, as some of my own work has shown, there is, I believe, a compelling case for a deeper subsector analysis. And I'll get into this in the next couple of slides, looking at residential versus non-residential construction. So residential being the building of houses and so on, non-residential focusing on other parts of the industry other than home building. And so another reason to focus on immigrant labor in construction is that construction is known as a gateway for foreign-born labor in the United States. It consistently ranks, as this study from the home builders in 2018 shows, it consistently outranks other parts of the economy in terms of the percentage of immigrants in its workforce. Construction continues to be one of the top-ranked industries in that regard. And when it comes to this portion of the literature, although it is relatively small, there is more consensus. Researchers have found consistent negative effects of immigration on native outcomes. And so following that, I propose the following hypothesis that there is in fact a negative relationship throughout all of US construction. But it doesn't really help to look at construction as just a singular entity, as other studies have done, as there are a lot of structural differences between the residential and non-residential subsectors. First off, non-residential projects are simply more complex on average than residential projects are. And so non-residential contractors are larger, more capital intensive rather than labor intensive. But also non-residential workers tend to be more educated, more highly skilled, and they have greater access to unionization and labor law protections than residential workers do, especially given that unionization is almost non-existent in the residential sector. And also you have to think about the illegal labor practices that are specific to the residential subsector. Payroll fraud, misclassification of workers as independent contractors, and also off the books employment where workers are just paid in cash lump sums. And these suggest differential effects of immigration. And so what I propose based on this research is that there's a moderating effect of subsector, such that the effect is more negative in residential than it is in non-residential construction. And there's also this idea of occupational licensing, which is very common in construction, and it's actually considered one of the fastest growing institutions in the US labor market. And occupations differ greatly on licensing. So for example, plumbers and engineers tend to be licensed state by state, whereas other occupations like carpenters and painters, they tend to not be. And so what this does is licensing effectively acts as a barrier to entry into the occupations that feature them, because you have to have a lot more on-the-job training requirements, educational requirements. And so what I propose is that Native workers in licensed occupations are more protected from immigrant labor than those in non-licensed occupations would be. And so that's what this hypothesis proposes, is that there's also a moderating effect of licensing, such that those in licensed occupations face less negative effects than those in licensed occupations. And so this is the one limitation. I have not gotten access to this data yet, but I am in the process of application. And so what I'm trying to get access to is LEHD data. And the reason I need it is to distinguish residential from non-residential employees. And it actually does define rather well which firms are residential and which firms are non-residential based on how much revenue they get from each source. And so following previous research, I also limit the sample in these following ways, and I'm just going to gloss over that rather quickly since I know we are short on time. And so my dependent variable, simply the natural log of annual earnings of native-born construction workers. And it's indexed by individual, metropolitan area, and year. And annual earnings I define as the sum of wage and salary income added to income from their own business or farm. The independent variable in my study is the proportion of foreign-born construction workers relative to the total workforce in a given metro area and year. And the American Community Survey actually has a nice variable to be able to define this, the birthplace variable. And so if their birthplace is in a US state or territory, I classify the worker as native born. Whereas if the birthplace is outside of a US state or territory, I classify their birthplace as foreign born, okay? And so these are the models that I have. So these are ordinary least squares models, indexed by individual metro area and year. And I have various demographic controls, work variables, but I also have fixed effects for metro area and year as well. And then to test hypothesis 2, again, this is the moderation effect of subsector. It's the same model as before, except I index both the independent and dependent variable by subsector. That is, whether it's residential or non-residential construction. And then finally, hypothesis 3, identical model, except now it is indexed by whether or not that particular worker is in a licensed occupation. And that is all I have. Thank you very much.
Bulin, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, thank you for the reminder. I forgot I unmute myself. Thank you, Matt. That's a really great talk about how immigrants may impact native workers' labor outcomes. And now we will move to our next presentation. And our next presenter is Lorin. So Lorin Obler is a senior analyst with the Education, Workforce, and Income Security team at the U.S. Government Accountability Office. In his 19 years with the GAO, Lorin has focused primarily on research related to federal disability, workforce programs, and some of his research projects he led in recent years have covered topics including the vocational rehabilitation program, accessibility of voting for people with disabilities, and the H-2B temporary worker visa program. So now I'm going to turn it over to Lorin.
Okay, hopefully you can see my slides here.
Lorin, I think you have to click on share screens.
Okay, I thought I did that, sorry. No.
Yeah, it's okay. It's on the bottom of the screen.
I'm sorry.
Or do you want me to share it for you?
Yes, can you do that? I'm not, yeah, for some reason I'm not able to do that.
Just let me know when you want to move from slides to slides.
Okay. Okay, well, why don't we start? Yeah, so I'm sorry for that delay. Yeah, so this is actually a nice segue from Matt's presentation to look at the H-2B visa program. And so I'll be talking about a report that we conducted, that we just completed in April of this year on the H-2B visa program, which is, to provide a little bit more context, this program is designed for employers in the U.S. to fill jobs that are temporary and non-agricultural. And there's a statutory cap that's been in place since the inception of the program in 1919 of 66,000 visas per year that for workers that can be brought in to the United States. In some years, Congress has authorized additional visas to be made available. And in recent years also, the federal agencies that administer the program have awarded the visas by lottery because of the high demand. And I should say also that obviously our work was completed before the current pandemic affected the labor market in the US at a time when unemployment was very low and demand for H-2B visas was high. And so the central debate about the H-2B visa program, similar to what Matt was just talking about, is whether these visas detract from US employment and maybe undermine US employment or wages and take jobs away from native workers, or the other perspective is that they actually enhance US employment by filling critical jobs that Americans don't want to fill and enhancing the growth of US companies. So if you could move to the next slide, please. And so we received a request from, bipartisan request from Democratic and Republican members of Congress to look at the H-2B visa program, including 4 research objectives, which you can see there. But basically looking at the trends in the demand for H-2B visas, looking at the impact of this H-2B visa cap on companies' economic performance and employment of US workers, looking at proposals to change the H-2B visa program, and finally looking at how the federal agencies that administer the program, Departments of Homeland Security and Labor, have sought to protect US workers and also meet employers' hiring needs. So I'll just give a quick highlight of our findings in each of those 4 areas. So if you can move to the next slide, please. And so starting with objective 1, as you can see, we found that the demand for H-2B visas has steadily climbed in recent years as the unemployment rate, the line there, has fallen. And demand is measured by the number of authorized visas that Department of Labor has approved for US companies which have established that they have a need for temporary workers and that no US workers are available to fill these positions. We also found that these visas have been used typically in about 1/6 of the counties in the United States, and these counties consistently have stronger labor markets than other counties, as measured by their lower unemployment rates and higher wage rates. And we also found that visas have been primarily concentrated in a few industries, in particular landscaping, but also construction, building what Matt was saying before, and seafood production and hospitality, and a few others. So if you could move to the next slide, please. And so turning to objective 2, in terms of a high level aggregate findings, to answer this objective, we interviewed 35 H-2B employers across 4 industries and locations. And these included employers that were awarded visas under the cap in 2018, and those that were randomly selected not to receive visas under the cap in 2018. And we had tried to do a broader data analysis of all companies, but there were limitations with the federal data, and we were not able to do that. So we had to focus on interviews with a select sample. And sort of overall findings here were that consistently companies across all these 4 locations and industries said that they experienced uncertainty due to this cap, and the uncertainty of whether they would be able to get the workers they had requested. And this affected their ability to plan and invest and hire more US workers. Looking at economic performance as measured by their revenue, companies that did not receive H-2B visas in 2018 reported declines in revenue. They're more likely to report declines in revenue than those that did receive visas. As for example, maybe a landscaping company couldn't fulfill its contracts due to not having sufficient workers. In terms of employment of US workers, that's not pictured here, but we did not find a significant pattern there with companies that received and didn't receive visas in 2018, both having about the same experience in terms of hiring or laying off US workers. If you can move to the next slide, please. And so drilling down a little bit more with objective 2, as I said, we did case studies of 4 different industries and 4 different locations. And just to provide some examples of the nuances here in terms of how different industries experience the H-2B visa cap. So for example, we looked at seafood processing on the eastern shore of Maryland. And there we found that companies that did not receive their visas reported the most significant declines in their revenue across all the 4 industries. And they also reported laying off some of their US workers. And so here with seafood production in Maryland, the H-2B visa workers constituted a significant proportion of the, very high proportion of their crab processors, people to pick the meat out of crabs after they've been harvested. So not getting the visas was a significant blow for some companies. And also their work had to be done within a tightly regulated season. Whereas construction, we looked at the construction industry around Phoenix, Arizona. There we saw that companies that did not receive visas did not report any significant declines in revenue or employment compared to those that did receive their visas. And here we found that the H-2B visas made up a much smaller proportion of the total workforce, and also that the construction companies were able to spread their work out across the year and leverage their existing US workers without really losing a lot of business. If you can turn to the next slide, please. And so with objective 3, we tried to identify some proposals for adjusting or changing the H-2B visa program. And to do this, we did a review of recent literature, and we also interviewed several knowledgeable stakeholders and experts. And we identified 6 proposals. This is not meant to be a comprehensive list, but these are 6 commonly discussed proposals that we identified. And we held discussion groups with a range of stakeholders and experts representing a wide range of perspectives on this program. And a few key themes emerged from those discussion groups. The one sort of perspective was that it was important to have reforms that would enhance certainty for employers. And so, for example, one proposal that I'll highlight here is to adjust the number of H-2B visas annually based on economic trends, such as unemployment rate, rather than having a static cap. And that would enhance certainty for employers. The other perspective that emerged was the need to enhance protections for American workers, for native-born workers, to ensure that their wages and job likelihood of getting a job is not undermined. And so they would say that for any kind of proposal that would increase the number of H-2B visas available, that needs to come with stronger protections on ensuring that that companies are doing their due diligence in recruiting US workers and paying a strong prevailing wage. And then finally, if you can go to the last slide. And so the last objective, we looked at how the federal agencies that administer the program are both addressing employers' needs for hiring H-2B workers and protecting U.S. workers. And I just want to highlight three findings from that objective. The first one is that Department of Homeland Security and Labor, in response to a congressional mandate, identified several options for reforming the H-2B visa program to enhance certainty for companies. And some of those were similar to the ones we identified in our.
To interrupt, we are running out of time.
Okay.
You can just briefly summarize. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll just finish really quick. And just so we recommended that those agencies take the next step of assessing those options to determine which were most effective. And then I'll just highlight the last one there is looking at protecting U.S. workers, and we found that the Department of Labor has, in terms of auditing H-2B employers to determine if they violated program regulations, needs to take a more targeted approach and audit those companies that are most likely to commit violations. So I'll end it there, but thank you. Thanks for moving the slides along.
Thank you. So I will stop sharing my screens. Thank you, Lorin. It's a really interesting presentation about how H-2B has impacted the economic performance and employment of US workers. And now I think we are going to move to a different context. And our next presentation is given by Professor Joseph Marchand. So Joseph Marchand is an associate professor in the Department of Economics, the principal investigator of Future Energy System grant examining what the future of energy means for labor markets, and the chair of minimum wage expert panel. So Joseph primarily conducts research and teaches within his field of labor economics, analyzing how local labor demand shocks can generate responses in the labor market and in distributional, educational, and health outcome. He also published research in the economics of aging. And now I'm going to turn it over to Joseph, and welcome Joseph for the next presentation.
Great, thank you. Let's see here. Can everyone see my title slide?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So what I'd like to share with you today is a paper, Local Labor Market Effects of Environmental Regulations. We're looking at a particular Canadian policy, the Canada-wide standards. This work is with Dana Andersen. He's the environmental economist on this project, and I'm the labor economist. And so this is a perfect topic to, or a perfect paper to marry the two topics. So I wanted to grab your attention today. That's what the first bullet point's for. If we think about everything that policymakers are grappling with today, they're thinking about COVID, they're thinking about these trade-offs between health and the economy. On the health side, overwhelmed hospitals, sickness and death as outcomes. On the economy side, contraction, loss in jobs, hours, earnings. When we think about environmental policy, at least the way Dana and I are coming to the literature, we're thinking about the same type of trade-offs. So on the health side, you've got polluted environment, polluted people, unhealthy people. For the economy, you might have a loss of firms, probably the worst polluters. We'll get into that in a moment. And then you could have a loss in jobs, earnings, and hours. Another way to think about it was summarized by Deschênes, which is a great 10-page piece if anybody's into this topic. So you've got pros and cons: cleaner air, better health, productivity. They're targeted programs. The cons are firm costs. Costs are going to go up. For pollution abatement, again, the jobs, earnings, hours losses, and they could possibly be anti-competitive as well. In terms of just focusing in on labor outcomes, the evidence is kind of mixed. So you've got a seminal paper like Greenstone that finds these large employment losses. You've got a paper like Walker that finds large earnings losses. And then you've got papers that kind of have nuance. They have loss and gains, which lead to net gains in terms of jobs and earnings for those two papers respectively. So when we switch to Canada, there's basically two studies on British Columbia's carbon tax, our westernmost province. In the labor market outcomes for that policy were that employment fell for the carbon intensive and trade exposed sectors, but employment grew in the less carbon sectors. So on net, small total employment increase, much like those last two papers. And then for the policy that we examined, there actually is a sister paper to this that focuses on plant level data. We're going to focus on aggregate labor market data. And they basically find that the policy explains 40% of the reduction in the targeted pollution, which is this PM 2.5. But they find no employment effects. So that's really the start for our paper. So the policy came in 2000. It's basically targeting PM 2.5, particulate matter 2.5 in ozone. And they're trying to meet these certain thresholds by 2010. And then it's over in 2012 when they replaced the policy. So that's our decade of a policy window. It's a federally established program, but the provinces are responsible for the stick of the policy, implementing the regulation. And then the regulations themselves are on these census metropolitan areas or census agglomeration areas. You could think of them similar to commuting zones in the US. Dirty industries are targeted, and we have about 90 CMAs or CAs across Canada on our pollution data side. So if you're not aware what the country looks like, this is Canada. These black dots are the stations that we're getting our pollution data from, and then the gray are those CMA, CA areas. So my co-author Dana did lots of calculation to crunch the pollution data down to these 4 sets, which is where we get all the bite for the treatment of the policy. So we have these new non-attainment switch outs, so they went over the threshold. They switched out of attainment, and then we have it for these 2 different types of pollution. We have new attainment, so now they switched in, went under the threshold. We have stay non-attainment, always outs, and then under the threshold we have the always ins. And basically our empirical method is to compare the top 3 groups to the bottom, to the always in. So what we do first is that we look at pollution outcomes. So we're going to see what happens to ozone pollution and particulate matter pollution after the year after the policy would have bitten, especially for those switch outs and the ones that are always out, because we think they're the ones that are getting the stick from the province. So what do we find? We do find significant reductions in pollution for those that switch out and for those that are always out. So this seems to be that the stick of the policy is biting, it is reducing pollution, and that's true for ozone and for particulate matter as well. But what you really came here for, this being a labor conference, is the labor data. So we use the labor force survey. We have the restricted data access version of this, or we did before COVID hit. We'll get back to it as soon as the data center reopens. But basically we use this labor force survey at the CMA level, and we run the same type of econometric model where what happened in the previous year is now looked at the outcomes in the next year, and we want to see what happens for basically employment, work hours, and earnings. I see your 2 minutes, yep. So for employment, we have a large aggregate employment count of workers. That's the first column. We have a definition of non-employment, which is basically lumping unemployed and not in the labor force together because the unemployed counts weren't large enough. So we had a lot of missings. So I kind of just made up this definition of non-employed. And then we made a definition of percent dirty jobs versus percent clean jobs in a CMA. But for none of these results, except for a kind of a spurious change here, do we find consistent reductions in employment. That's true for ozone. That's also true for particulate matter. So going with the result for employment from our sister paper there, we completely agree at the aggregate labor data level with their plant level data in terms of the employment outcome. When we look at hours worked, It's basically the same story that we don't find a significant effect. So that's true for usual hours worked. That's true for actual hours worked. And then we go to earnings, and that's where we find the bite of the policy. So we do find significantly large reductions, at least in terms of ozone pollution, in hourly and weekly earnings for those that would have got the biggest hit with the stick. That's the switch outs and the always outs. That said, we do find a slight reduction for those that switched in as well. Okay, so just to summarize the results from the study, the policy did significantly reduce air pollution, what it set out to do for both types of pollution. There's a little nuance here that there was some reversion once the policy was no longer binding. You can look to the paper to see that. What we find for employment is basically a significant non-finding. Doesn't seem like this particular policy was associated with lower employment or even in a gain in non-employment or a change in the dirty share of employment. Usual hours worked were not significantly altered. Actual hours worked had a small and significant reduction, but it's not enough to have a very strong conclusion. And lastly, significant reductions in both hourly earnings and weekly earnings were found for this policy, with slightly larger magnitudes for hourly over weekly. And if you're interested in this intersection of labor markets and environmental policy for Canada, I suggest to take a look at these 4 papers. I can give the sites through the chat as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So next we will move to Weihao. Weihao Li. So Weihao Li is a 4th-year PhD student at School of Labor and Employment Relations, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His research has been focused on the interplay between workforce governance and political extremism in Europe. And his research interests also include employee voice, comparative political economy, and alternative dispute resolution. So now I'm going to hand it over to Weihao.
Okay, thanks, Bulin. Hi, everyone. I'm Weihao. I'm going to talk about a paper examining the effectiveness of employee voices. And although this paper was arranged to be in this session, it does not have much comparative components. And it's been revised a lot since it was accepted by the conference. I already pre-recorded the presentation, so I will play the video in a second. It's about 8 minutes. Please feel free to write me comments and questions in the chat box, and I will do my best to answer them during the Q&A. And here comes my presentation. Hello, this paper examines the role of employee voice 2 dimensions in shaping their effectiveness in firms. And I argue that a voice flow's direction and interest it bears determine whether the voice can be translated into effects on organizational outcomes, such as firm performance and employee outcomes. Employee voices have been received an extensive attention by business leaders and scholars from different fields. The antecedents and effects of them have been well observed and documented. The employee voice is a broad term which encompasses many similar topics and ideas, and it has been generally recognized to be good for both firms and employees. However, despite the strong theoretical prescriptions and manager extensions, the empirical findings have showed mixed results, which lead us to ask why some employee voice mechanisms are more effective than others. Do voice mechanisms have equal effectiveness on both firm and employee outcomes? What are the implications that employer and employees can learn from the heterogeneity of voice effects? The paper tries to answer these questions. Scholars have studied many aspects of employee voices, and so useful classifications have been created to distinguish and study them. Employee voice practices can be sorted into different categories by different criteria. For example, hierarchy differentiates voice by workers' control. Voice source could be direct or indirect. Channels could be independent or employer promulgated. Forms could be singular or bundled practices, and business strategies could be high road or low road. The commonalities shared and differences indicated by these ways of classifications revealed 2 critical dimensions of voice. which have not been delineated and empirically examined. When treating the employee voice as a type of information flow, it is not difficult to see the directionality and the intentionality of it. Management scholars have been studying the voice flow's direction, including upward flow, a flow that streams from subordinates to their formal leaders, and lateral flow, an information communication stream that flows among peer workers with the same formal rank in their unit. It is argued that the voice targeted at managers are more effective because managers have more resources and power to address the raising issues. Also, employees tend to be selective about what to talk to their managers. They tend to provide high-quality ideas to their managers, whereas studies show that information flow among co-workers are more likely to be time-wasting. Also, the intentionality reveals that the voice vehicle can carry either firm performance promoting information or employment promoting ideas. It has been found that the voice focused on one aspect, for example, productivity, is likely to at least promote the quality of that aspect of workplace. This table shows how the different types of voice flow are operationalized in this study. Joint decision-making on production is an upward flow with performance-promoting intention, whereas joint decision-making on employment relations is an upward flow with employment-promoting intention. Unit autonomy are lateral voice flows streaming among peer workers. They can be about unit work performance or unit personal management. Now, let's move on to the data and its measures. The data used for this study were obtained from Korea Workplace Panel Survey, which has been conducted every other year since 2005 by the Korea Labor Institute, a government-funded policy research body. The dataset is a representative sample of workplaces with 30 or more employees. Personal interviews with managers were conducted using computer-assisted personal interviewing system during visits by interviewers. KWPS includes extensive information on indicators of human resources and industrial relations policies and practices. The time frame of this study is from 2005 to 2013, 5 waves in total, while later waves were excluded from this study because of the increased attrition rate of the original sample in 2005. Each of the waves contains more than 1,700 workplaces from private and public sector, and among them, around 700 private workplaces survived throughout all 5 waves. I examined the effectiveness of different types of voice mechanisms by looking at their effects on both employer and employee outcomes. Firm performance is a composite score generated by questions answered by managers about their perceived labor productivity and financial performance of the establishments. And employee outcomes is also a composite score generated by questions about turnover and quality of the employment relations. Joint decision-making variables are also composite scores indicating whether the employee has actual power in deciding management plan, machinery introduction, and manufacturing plan, or whether they have a say in decisions of subcontracting and downsizing. Unit autonomies are measured by ordinal scores. Work autonomy is about whether the workers can decide their working pace and working methods of their unit. Personnel autonomy is about whether the unit can decide members' training and recruitment. It also includes a variety of controls, including employment size, asset size, foreign shares, and other possible voice mechanisms. Here are the regression results. The left 2 columns are the results from the OLS regressions, and the right 2 columns are the results from the fixed effects regressions. The results indicate that joint decision-making on production as an upward and productivity intended voice flow has statistically significant effects on firm performance, but not on employee outcomes. However, joint decision-making on employment relations as an upward and employment relations intended voice flow does not have positive effects on either firm or employee outcomes. Unit work autonomy as a lateral voice flow intended for productivity shows positive effects on both employer and employee outcomes in OLS regressions, but the statistical significance disappeared when implemented with fixed effects. As expected, unit union personnel autonomy as a lateral voice flow intended for employment relations has no statistically significant effects on either firm or employment outcomes. The table summarizes the results briefly. The results tell us that even voice taking the same vehicle, they have heterogeneous effects due to the directionality of the flow. Upward flow employee voices are generally more effective than lateral flow in generating firm performance. Upward flows do not generate positive employee outcomes, even the voice itself is employment relations concerned. The intentionality of the voice also matters. Performance-concerned voice are more likely to generate positive effects for both the employer and the employee. Taking both directionality and intentionality of the voice, implications for the employer is that when constructing voice procedures, the primary should be making sure the voice is capable to reach business leaders. For employees, even if the voice is intended to promote working conditions, this should relate the idea with productivity to increase the chance to have the idea implemented. Lastly, a major limitation of this study is that it may suffer from common method bias as all answers are provided by managers. This concludes the presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. Any comments or feedback are super welcome. I can be reached at the listed email address. Hello, this paper examines the role of. All right, that's it. Thank you so much for watching my video.
Okay, thank you, Weihao, for the presentation. And now we are moving to the next presenter. Let's welcome Charles and Sharon for giving us the next presentation, and they will introduce themselves before the presentation. I will hand it over to both of you.
Okay. Thank you, Bulin. First, I want to say, who we are. I know our colleague Lorin talked earlier. We're with the U.S. Government Accountability Office. We are the nonpartisan investigative arm of the U.S. Congress. What that means is we work for the legislative branch of the government and not for the president or the executive branch. This is some work that was we were asked to do by Senator Schatz from Hawaii, as well as several other senators, basically to look at this issue of today what is known as ESG, economic, social, and governance factor risks in retirement plan investments. And what do we mean by ESG? ESG is, you can think of it as socially responsible investment 2.0. And what that means is in the past, there was a lot of discussion that pension plans should not invest in, for example, in South Africa. And a lot of this, there were sound financial issues to be explored, but a lot of it had much more of a moral imperative. Today, in some sense, the emphasis has been switched a little bit. Today, the issue of ESG is really trying to identify risks which might have, affect financial performance, but are not otherwise incorporated into the risk assessment for where to invest. So for example, if you're a mortgage company thinking about giving mortgages in Florida, you might want to incorporate into whatever into your risk assessments that a good chunk of Florida is going to be underwater in the next 20 years. And so giving 30-year mortgages out might not be the best product for you to offer there. So in some sense, it's to bring into account risk which might not otherwise be incorporated into an assessment of what a company should be doing. And it's also an issue of what's called materiality, something that explicitly affects your company, and it may have a larger or smaller effect depending on the particular investment issue that you're looking at. And so Sharon and I are going to be switching off on it. Let's, in this particular report, let me just go over that really quick. ESG is really something that's sweeping the world. It's very incorporated throughout Asia and Europe by pension funds and asset managers. And basically the Congress, they asked us to look at the extent to which US retirement plans are considering ESG. And then also, how does the regulatory framework in the United States help or hinder the consideration of ESG by pension plans? And with that, Sharon, I'll turn it over to you, and you can walk through the basic what we found.
I just have to remember to unmute.
Oh.
Thanks, Charlie. Yeah, so one of the first things that we looked at in this work is the evidence about the relationship between ESG factors and financial performance. And this is a really essential question when it comes to how retirement plans are managed, because they're very protected under federal law. They have to be managed in the best interest of participants. So a plan sponsor, when making investment decisions, they cannot sacrifice financial performance for other goals, even if they're very virtuous, moral, ethical goals. So we did a thorough literature review. There's actually been a lot of studies that have looked at this question, and we found that in the vast majority of cases, using ESG factors is associated with either a neutral or positive effect. So this suggests that there really is evidence ESG, can be a valid financial consideration, and it can be in the best interest of participants. And our findings were consistent with other meta-analyses that have looked at that question. We did some work looking at the prevalence of, the extent to which ESG is used. As Charlie mentioned, it's much more widely used in other parts of the world. This was the most recent data available at the time of our report, but if we had the more recent data, you would continue to see this uptick in US assets under management that take ESG considerations into account. In fact, I looked at it earlier this morning and it was over $12 trillion, up from 4.7 here in 2016. However, when you look at the US retirement space, you see a different trend. Basically very few plans currently offer an ESG option. And there's no comprehensive data here, but the best data that we found were these large annual surveys of 401k type plans. The studies we found all had fewer than 10% of plans offering an ESG option to their workers. And none of them had ESG in their default option, which is important because a lot of people are automatically enrolled to their plans. And unless they actively opt out of that default and find an ESG option, even the plans that offer it will have, very low numbers of people investing in this way. So let me skip ahead. Okay, so I'll just touch on this really briefly. We talked to a lot of the largest asset managers and retirement plans about the challenges and benefits of using ESG factors. The main thing we heard on the con side is that ESG data are less straightforward to work with. If you think about what are environmental factors, well, something like carbon emissions, there's different ways to measure it. When it comes to governance, how robust a company's corporate governance structure is, their protections against conflict of interest, there's, it's not an easy thing to measure. And so it's hard to compare that data. However, there's a lot of attention that's been focused on improving this data and coming up with a standardized framework. So we've heard the data quality are improving and are expected to, improve much more. On the pro side, I'll just highlight, what Charlie had mentioned about risk management. That was really the primary consideration we heard, that these factors do matter to companies' business models. They vary depending on what sector they're in, but they are very material. And so by having more information, even if the data aren't perfect, that's better than not having anything. So it really helps the plan sponsor and their asset manager to better, manage these investment risks, especially over the long term. And, just with the recent market downturns and variability with the pandemic, the evidence about ESG does kind of support this finding, where you see that some of the large ESG indices have declined less in value than the broader indices. So, that would suggest that they are, at least for now, being more resilient. We did some more in-depth case studies of retirement plans, primarily outside of the US, that are actually using ESG factors to kind of understand what does this look like. And we don't really have time today to get into a lot of the details about that, but I think the main takeaway is that there's a broad spectrum here ranging from, fairly light touch to more intensive approaches. So for example, one common thing that we heard about is that there's ESG ratings data, and some plans will take that information into account and use it into how they weight their portfolio. So for example, they would overweight their exposure to companies that rate more favorably on these ESG factors, and then underweight their exposure to companies that are not performing as well, while maintaining overall diversification. Thank you. So, as Charlie said, we're not talking about divestment here. So one last thing I'll mention, the engagement, that's also a very prevalent practice where, retirement plans and their asset managers, they're shareholders in very large companies. And so by virtue of being shareholders, they can directly engage with those companies or vote their shares or file resolutions to encourage those companies to better manage these risks. And that's happening a lot, especially when it comes to climate change and emissions. So with that, I will wrap up. And Charlie, do you have anything you want to add before we finish?
Well, I guess on slide 20, maybe go to that one. Just a few final points here. One is there's a lot of talk of ESG, but there's also climate change. Actually, maybe the next slide on the food for thought.
Okay.
Climate change is so pervasive. There is so much data on it, and the scientific evidence is overwhelming that this is really more and more becoming one aspect of ESG, which is being incorporated by a lot of companies. In fact, BlackRock in the US came out recently and put out a major statement about considering climate change risk in assessing potential of investments. So is a question of, is climate change risk a unique example of ESG, or is it just one of all of the others which are as important as well? Okay, the next slide. The other big slide, the other really important thing is that so much discussion of ESG as socially responsible investment still has this 1980s perspective in the sense of focusing on traditional pensions. But in reality, traditional pensions in the United States are rapidly disappearing. Today, there is way more money in 401k type plans, account-based plans than pensions. Many pensions that remain are in the public sector. A lot of these are experiencing funding challenges. And so the real discussion, the real debate now really is, rather than focusing between fiduciary responsibility and rates of return for pension plans, is how do we get account-based plans, 401k plans, to focus on ESG issues. And so it's a really different discussion here, because investments here are in the 401k world are dictated by participant choice. So how do you get participants to choose ESG plan fund options? One, you could have them be offered, but even this may not be enough. You certainly need to inform participants more, give people more disclosure. And as Sharon mentioned earlier, there's an issue of in the 401k world, for people who are not following their investments, of which there is a massive number, you have default options. To have default options include an ESG type orientation would do a lot to move money, to move assets in the direction of addressing climate change issues. And I think with that, we're ready for questions.
Great. Thank you, Sharon and Charles, for a great talk about the ESG factors. I think we can start the discussion part. So if you have any kinds of questions, you can put it in the chat box, or you can use the hand raise feature, and I will call you to unmute yourself and ask questions.
Can I just raise my hand like this? Sorry, I don't know how to do that. Just an easy question for Matt. So you seem to be in the same boat as us, where you're having some data access issues. I'm wondering if that's COVID related, like us, where the research data center is just closed, or have you not applied for the data yet, or is it just kind of paused in the process, or just curious about that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's a mixture of both. We're getting ready to submit the application, but yeah, the data center's closed, and We're not exactly sure when they're going to open back up. So yeah, it is a combination of the two. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Any other questions so far?
Actually, I had one for Charles and Sharon as well. So actually, first a comment that here at the University of Alberta, we actually do still have defined benefit pension plans. So we're like one of the last holdouts, I think, up here. We're a dying breed, though. So you're definitely right about that. So being in Alberta, with the oil sands located right about that way past downtown, you know, we tend to think of these environmental issues kind of a bit differently, I suppose, right? I'm not sure if that's the right word, but let's say just differently. And one of the metrics that companies tout here is how much they spend on kind of environmentally friendly processes and abatement of pollution, et cetera. And so you hear, you know, I'll just throw a company name out there. Suncor spent $3 billion, and that's the most environmental spending of any company or something like that. So how do we think about that in terms of what you're analyzing? Because it's hard for me to grasp that, and I just hit you with it, so maybe it's hard for you to grasp as well.
Well, Sharon, do you want me to take a shot first, Sharon, and then you can jump in? I think one of the issues, the way we looked at this, and from the perspective from the perspective of a pension plan which is looking to invest, or you're a fund manager and you're looking where to place your money. So certainly a company that's trying to abate pollution, I think it would be a consideration. But then, you know, you look at the broader issues in the market. So for example, today in the United States, gasoline is cheaper than it was when I was in high school.
Is that right?
The costs of renewable energies, you know, wind and solar are continuing to come down in price. And so there's a real concern for, like, for example, big oil company. If you're a pension plan, do you want to put a lot of money into a company that has large reserves of oil that potentially might not be economically feasible to extract, essentially stranded assets? Would you, a company that has large retail network of gasoline stations? Well, you know, to the extent that electric cars are becoming more important, those assets might not be worth as much as they might have in the past. So that would be all going into your calculation of, as a pension plan, trying to maximize my return to being a good fiduciary, good steward for my participants. You know, is that the place that I would want to put my money? And so the whole issue of ESG is incorporating risks of that nature into the calculations for a pension plan to essentially try to make sure that you do as well as you possibly can for your participants. So Sharon, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
I think she lost the video function. But another question. So Charles Smith asked a question about huge amounts of global capital are being directed towards blockchain. How would the ESG integrate with this movement? That's his question.
Oh, could you repeat that question?
Yeah, let me put it in the PowerPoint and share it with you. Just last question, I think, because we are running out of time. So can you see here? He asks huge amounts of global capital being directed. How would the ESG integrate with this movement?
Well, to me, okay, blockchain is a way of doing, as I understand it, doing arrangements, trade arrangements that, you know, they of making sure that money or assets are, there are purchase transactions that are occurred in very safe ways and can facilitate the efficiency of transactions. I think from the perspective of ESG, it comes back to you would want to do you would want to do an assess. I mean, to me, that wouldn't directly affect ESG. It might be something that once you figured out the particular risks, the material risks of a particular investment opportunity, the blockchain issues would simply facilitate that occurring more frequent, you know, more efficiently, more quickly than it might otherwise. It's not clear to me that, at least, you know, I think from a pension plan at this point, it's not clear what the explicit ESG issues would be from blockchain by itself.
Thank you. I think we can continue the discussion after this session because we already ran out of time. So just a conclusion, thank you everyone for the great presentation today, and due to time limits, we have to end the session now. But if you have further questions or want to continue the discussion, you're welcome to join the discussion board on LERA conference website to continue the discussion in regards to our session. And thank you for all your participation in today's session, and I hope you enjoy the meeting and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Take care,
Bye.
everyone.
Charlie, quick question.
Oh yeah.